Hello everybody, it's Jay Roby. Going to be starting a new chess series off with this video, and it's going to focus on endgame play from the Grandmasters. And I thought it only fitting to start off with the Bobby Fischer match, and he was playing a gentleman by the name of Rodolfo Cardoso. And Fischer's white in this position, and it's white to move. And at this time, Fischer wasn't a Grandmaster yet, and neither was Cardoso. But if you look at Cardoso's story, it's an interesting one. He was actually the first Asian international master of all time, and he won the Philippine Junior Chess Championship in 1956, and he also participated in a bunch of chess Olympiads, and he got a silver medal actually in Moscow in 1956. So at the time, this was in 1958, he was a strong player. And but this was on the verge of Fischer's meteoric rise to the chess world, and shortly hereafter Fischer would become a Grandmaster. But I thought I'd use this endgame to start off with. Now, this isn't going to be one of those videos where you guess the move. Instead, we're going to just kind of explore the entire endgame from this position on, talk about the position, and I'm hoping over time, by making these videos, that my endgame will improve, and hopefully yours will too. So we'll get started here. Fischer's playing white, and it's white to move. Now, before we get into the actual moves that took place, let's just take a look at the position. You'll notice a couple things. First of all, Fischer has two pawn islands that are very secure, and together there's no doubled up pawns on Fischer's board. And Fischer also has this nice bishop here on c4. And you'll notice that a lot of Rodolfo's pawns are on light squares, so this bishop is very strong. And you'll also notice that on the A file, this pawn is a passed pawn. So there's no black pawns that are going to be able to blockade the A pawn, and Fischer's going to be able to exploit that as the match progresses. In fact, this position as it stands is quite favorable to white, and I think that Fischer knew that. And the reason it's favorable to white is simply because if we take a look at black's position, you'll notice that black has some doubled up pawns here on the E file. Black has a knight versus a strong bishop, and Black's king is still in its castle position on g8, so Fischer's king is actually a little bit closer to the action than his opponent's king. So Fischer's position as it stands is a stronger position, and the engines score it quite favorable to white, almost a couple pawns advantage, even though the material is equal. So seeing this, Fischer makes the move rook to d1. Fischer wants to remove the material off the board and capitalize on his position. Rodolfo doesn't want to do that just yet, so he plays his king to f8. But from this position, Fischer just captures the rook, and once Rodolfo recaptures, Fischer moves his rook now to d1. And this rook really has nowhere to go. Rodolfo could have played his pawn up to e5 to allow capture back with the pawn, but instead Rodolfo decided to go ahead and take Fischer's rook. Fischer recaptures, and now we get into one minor piece each, and the same amount of pawns. But now Fischer's going to capitalize on his position, and in particularly, he's going to capitalize on the placement of his pawns. I think his pawns and his strong bishop are instrumental in this endgame position. So from here, Rodolfo plays his king up to e7, and Fischer brings his king up now to d2. Rodolfo brings his king to d6, and Fischer now puts his king onto c3. And you'll notice that from this position, c3, Fischer has a lot of options for his king. He can move to d4, attacking this pawn here, forcing the knight to defend, or he could get his king onto the queen side quite quickly. He also has the option to come back and maneuver in these squares to help support these pawns. So Fischer's king is very, very nicely placed in this position. Rodolfo's king is close to the center as well, but the options of this king are a little bit limited. If we take a look at the bishop here on c4, the bishop is basically stopping the king from accessing d5, and as we'll see as the game progresses, this diagonal here is going to be very important for Fischer's endgame play. So from here now, Rodolfo moves the knight off to d7. Fischer now plays his king up to d4, and you'll notice that by doing so, Fischer gains opposition. So the rule of opposition states that whoever is to move with an odd number of squares in between the kings does not have opposition. So in this position with the kings, Rodolfo does not have the opposition. But he just leaves his king there and moves his knight now to f6, defending the pawn on e4. And Fischer now takes the opportunity to push up his passed pawn on the a file to a4. So he wants to get that up higher to the board, closer to promotion. Now, this strategy by Fischer is going to create some pressure on Rodolfo, because if he's got action going on these files here, maneuvering up the ranks to promotion, this is going to leave Rodolfo weakened on this side of the board here, because his king is going to have to be forced to do play on the queen side, and Fischer has these connected pawns. Rodolfo's got the doubled up pawns here, but he also has to be careful of protecting the pawn on e4. So Fischer can capitalize on that by making a push on the queen side. So from here, Rodolfo checks, and Fischer moves now king to e3. And if you remember, we talked a little bit earlier about how Fischer has the options to basically swing his king to either side of the board, with more options than Rodolfo has. So from here, Rodolfo pushes the pawn up to g5. Fischer brings his bishop back. Rodolfo plays king now to c6. And Fischer just moves the bishop back. Now you'll notice that Fischer is basically maintaining control of this diagonal, and it's very important because it's stopping the king from getting too close into the position, especially on the queen side, at least for the short term. Rodolfo plays pawn now to e5, and Fischer continues to push the pawn up on the a file. Basically, he's forcing Rodolfo to pay a lot of attention to this pawn on a5. So Rodolfo plays pawn to h6, and Fischer brings his king now to d2, and Rodolfo continues moving the pawns up here on the h file, but Fischer's not worried about it because he's got his 3 pawns here, and there's only 2 opposing pawns coming down. And these pawns here that are doubled up can be easily stopped and blockaded. So from here, Fischer plays king now to e3. And if we take a moment and just take a look at the position, you'll notice that the amount of moves that Black has is diminishing quite rapidly. So now that Fischer's blockaded these pawns on the e file, Black doesn't have a lot of good options to move. This square here is taken away from its king by the pawn on a5, and this diagonal is being firmly controlled by Fischer's bishop. So the king can't even access the squares needed to attack this a pawn just yet. So Rodolfo plays pawn to h4. The computer liked king to b7, but either way, it's a very difficult position for Black to be in. Fischer responds by bringing the bishop back now to e2. From here, Rodolfo now plays king to b7, and Fischer places the bishop back onto c4. In this position now, Rodolfo brings the king back, and actually there's a bunch of king moves here, possibly jockeying around for position, but once Fischer gets the king onto d2 and Rodolfo plays king to c7, Fischer now pushes the pawn up to g4, and it doesn't really matter if the pawn is captured en passant here. These pawns are going to be now locked down. So from here, Rodolfo plays king to c6, and Fischer now puts his king onto c3. Rodolfo now moves the knight off to e8, and Fischer plays pawn up to b4. Now instead of capturing here, Rodolfo brings the knight down to d6, attacking the bishop. But really, Fischer just has to swing that bishop back, and you'll notice that the bishop is still controlling this diagonal, and the pawn here is preventing the king from accessing that square. So this king is still locked out of the area. So from here, Rodolfo captures, Fischer recaptures, and now Rodolfo plays knight back to c8. Now from this position, Fischer just moves his bishop over to g2, attacking the unprotected pawn on e4. So now Black is in an extremely dangerous position. Now this pawn is attacked, White has this passed pawn on the a file, and the king is right beside it for protection. So the options that Black has is just diminishing and diminishing in terms of positional strength. So Rodolfo moves the king to d5 to protect this pawn, and now Fischer continues to march up this pawn for promotion. Rodolfo plays knight to a7 to block it, and Fischer simply plays now king to a5. And you'll notice that if Fischer can get his king into this area, it's going to be all over for Black. So Rodolfo tries to get his king back into the action by playing king back to c5, and Fischer simply takes that pawn now with the bishop, and Rodolfo plays his knight to b5. Fischer just brings the bishop back. Rodolfo plays the knight again to a7, and now Fischer makes a very important move. He peels his king back to a4. Rodolfo moves the knight back to b5, and Fischer takes his king farther away from his passed pawn. Now Rodolfo comes in to take that pawn, but I think you'll see what Fischer's up to here, because after Rodolfo played king to b6, Fischer simply plays king now to c4, and it's all over for Black. Rodolfo does capture the pawn, but now White can march in and just munch up those pawns left and right, and shortly hereafter, in this position right now, Rodolfo resigned. So it was a really good endgame from Fischer. Not just the endgame play in and of itself, but the way that Fischer actually built the position leading into the endgame. So if you go back to the beginning here, from this position, Fischer could see that he had a lot of things to his advantage. And what really stuck out to me, of course, was the doubled pawns. We have the strong bishop, we have the passed pawn, and those small advantages built up over the course of the game, in the middle game, and coming out of the opening, created this strong position for Fischer going into the endgame. So, from my perspective, what I've taken from this is just to try to work towards building up those small advantages coming out of the opening and during the middle game play to create a favorable endgame position to work from. So take care, hope you enjoy the video, and we'll see you next time.